Let's dive straight in. Bloody Italy. It was 11:36 a.m., August 14, 2018, in the city of Genoa, Italy. The Morandi Bridge, a massive highway bridge that carried thousands of cars a day, was packed with traffic. Families were heading out of town for summer holidays, workers were returning from shifts, and trucks carried goods across the span. The sky was gray, with heavy rain pouring down, but to most drivers, it felt like just another day on the road. By 11:40 a.m., the rain grew heavier. Drivers flicked on their headlights and windshield wipers. Beneath the surface, however, the bridge's concrete and steel cables, already weakened from decades of wear and poor maintenance, were at a breaking point. Nobody on the road knew it, but one of the main supporting towers had been deteriorating for years. At 11:50 a.m., traffic slowed to a crawl near the middle of the bridge. Some cars were stuck in bumper-to-bumper jams. Others moved cautiously across the wet surface. Then, without warning, disaster struck. A massive section of the bridge, nearly 700 feet long, suddenly gave way. In seconds, cars and trucks plunged more than 150 feet down into the valley below, landing on warehouses, train tracks, and a river. By 12 p.m., chaos erupted. Survivors crawled from wrecked vehicles, stunned and drenched in rain. Witnesses from nearby apartments described hearing a deafening roar, like thunder mixed with an explosion. Clouds of dust rose into the air as the broken roadway collapsed in pieces. Emergency calls flooded Genoa's dispatch centers. At 12:15 p.m., firefighters, police, and ambulances rushed to the scene. The rain kept pouring, making rescue efforts even harder. Teams climbed over twisted steel and shattered concrete, searching for survivors. Some people had miraculously survived the fall, pulled from crushed cars, but many others were trapped beneath the rubble. By the evening of August 14th, the scale of the tragedy became clear. 43 people had died, families, workers, and travelers caught at the wrong place, wrong time. The disaster sparked outrage and forced officials to tear down and rebuild the bridge completely. Dance of the Dead. It was 7 p.m., July 17, 1981, in Kansas City, Missouri. The Hyatt Regency Hotel was buzzing with excitement. Hundreds of people had gathered for a tea dance in the hotel's massive atrium. Couples were dancing, friends were chatting, and 3 skywalks, suspended walkways that hung above the atrium, gave spectators a perfect view from above. By 7:30 p.m., the party was in full swing. About 1,600 people filled the lobby and the walkways. Music echoed through the atrium as the crowd enjoyed the summer evening. On the second and fourth floors, guests leaned against the railings of the suspended walkways, watching the crowd below. Nobody realized that the steel rods holding those walkways were under immense strain. At 7:45 p.m., the band played louder, and the dance floor grew more crowded. People pointed up at the walkways, waving to friends leaning over the railings. From the ground, everything looked safe, but high above, the bolts and connections were beginning to give way. Then, at 7:58 p.m., disaster struck. With no warning, the fourth-floor walkway suddenly dropped, crashing directly onto the second-floor walkway below. The combined weight was too much, and both walkways collapsed together, falling into the packed lobby. In a matter of seconds, tons of steel and concrete slammed into the crowd beneath. By 8 p.m., the atrium was chaos. Survivors screamed for help, while others were trapped beneath twisted beams and rubble. Dust and debris filled the air. First responders rushed in within minutes, but the scene was overwhelming. Rescue teams crawled through mangled steel to reach survivors, while hotel staff and bystanders tried desperately to lift debris with their bare hands. By the next morning, the tragedy was clear. 114 people had died, and more than 200 were injured. It was one of the deadliest structural failures in American history. In the weeks that followed, investigators discovered a fatal design flaw. The steel rods supporting the walkways had been doubled up during construction, transferring double the weight onto a single set of bolts. Under the heavy crowd, the design couldn't hold. Bridge of Death. It was 6:30 p.m., October 30th, 2022, in the town of Mumbai, India. The 140-year-old suspension bridge over the Machhu River had just reopened days earlier after months of renovation. It was a Sunday evening, and families were out celebrating the Diwali holiday. Kids ran along the walkway, couples strolled across, and tourists snapped photos of the sunset. By 6:40 p.m., the bridge was packed. Reports say as many as 400 to 500 people crowded onto the span, way more than it could safely handle. Some visitors shook the cables and jumped playfully, not realizing how fragile the old structure really was. From a distance, the bridge swayed noticeably, but to those on it, it felt like harmless fun. At 6:50 p.m., disaster struck. Without warning, the suspension cables suddenly snapped. In a terrifying chain reaction, the narrow bridge twisted and collapsed, throwing hundreds of people into the river below. Screams filled the air as the walkway gave way, plunging men, women, and children into the dark water. By 7 p.m., the riverbanks turned into scenes of chaos. Survivors clung to broken cables and pieces of the bridge, while others struggled in the strong current. Onlookers rushed to help, throwing ropes and makeshift lifelines into the water. Some jumped in, pulling strangers to safety. At 7:15 p.m., police, soldiers, and rescue teams began arriving. The sheer number of victims was overwhelming. Boats moved quickly to pull people from the river, while divers searched desperately for those trapped below. Families onshore cried out for missing loved ones, praying they be found alive. By midnight, the full scale of the disaster was clear. 141 people had died, including dozens of children. Many more were injured, and hundreds of families were shattered in one night. The tragedy stunned India and made headlines around the world. Hell 4. It was 7 a.m., June 29, 1995, in Seoul, South Korea. The Sampoong department store was already alive with activity. Staff prepared for the day, food vendors set up their counters, and early shoppers trickled in. The building was huge, with 5 floors of shops, restaurants, and boutiques, one of the busiest malls in the city. By 10 a.m., crowds filled the aisles. Families wandered between stores, kids begged for toys, and workers rushed to restock shelves. To anyone inside, it felt like just another summer shopping day. But behind the scenes, staff had noticed worrying cracks forming in the ceiling. Managers had seen them the night before, but instead of evacuating, they decided to keep the mall open. At 12 p.m., those cracks grew bigger. Shoppers and employees on the top floor noticed loud pops and creaks, like something heavy straining above them. Still, no official warning was given. Customers kept shopping, unaware that the building was inching closer to disaster. By 5 p.m., the situation had become critical. A loud snapping noise echoed through the mall, and ceiling tiles began falling. Shoppers screamed and ran, but it was too late. At 5:52 p.m., the entire 5-story building collapsed in seconds. Concrete slabs pancaked down floor by floor, trapping hundreds of people inside. The sound was like an earthquake, and dust clouds blanketed the streets outside. For the next 17 days, more than 2,500 rescue workers searched nonstop. Miraculously, a handful of survivors were pulled from the wreckage even a week later, but the majority never made it out. When the final count was tallied, 502 people had died, and more than 900 were injured, making it one of the deadliest modern building collapses in history. Investigators soon revealed shocking truths. The building had been poorly designed, and construction shortcuts were taken to save money. Extra floors had been added illegally, and heavy air conditioning units were placed on the roof, stressing the structure beyond its limits. Bloody Wednesday. It was 8 a.m., April 24, 2013, in Savar, a busy suburb near Dhaka, Bangladesh. The Rana Plaza building stood 8 stories tall, housing shops, offices, and several garment factories where thousands of workers made clothes for global brands. That morning, employees streamed in as usual, carrying lunch boxes and chatting with friends. But many workers were uneasy. The day before, cracks had appeared in the walls of the building. News had spread quickly, and some shops and a bank inside the complex had closed out of fear. Still, factory managers pushed garment workers to return, threatening to withhold wages if they didn't. By 8:45 a.m., the sewing machines roared to life. Floors were packed with workers hunched over tables, cutting and stitching fabric. Outside, traffic and street vendors filled the sidewalks, completely unaware of the danger looming above. At 8:57 a.m., the building began to tremble. People inside heard loud cracking sounds as the top floor shook. In seconds, the entire building collapsed like a house of cards. Concrete, steel, and machinery crashed down, trapping thousands in an instant. The noise was deafening, and a massive cloud of dust rolled across the streets. By 9:10 a.m., chaos erupted around the site. Survivors crawled from the rubble, bleeding and crying for help. Others were trapped in darkness, calling out from beneath collapsed floors. Locals rushed in first, pulling people out with their bare hands. Soon, rescue teams arrived, climbing over unstable debris, listening for faint voices in the rubble. By the end, the numbers were staggering. 1,134 people had died, and more than 2,500 were injured. It became one of the deadliest industrial disasters in modern history. The Rana Plaza collapse wasn't just a tragedy for Bangladesh. It shook the entire world. It forced a hard look at the cost of cheap clothing and the lives of the workers who make it. For the survivors and families, though, it was a day they could never forget. A morning that began with routine and ended with unimaginable loss.